Hey everyone, and welcome to today's episode where I have a very special friend and guest. We've kind of teamed up today, right, to really present a three-part series on taboo and intrusive thoughts. And so this is Christina Orlovo, and she is a licensed marriage family therapist, right? And so because I'm a licensed social worker, so there's this little difference. But so thanks so much for teaming up on me with this. And the reason, the one of the reasons that we wanted to do this when we were collaborating was, this is OCD Awareness Week is coming up in October. And this month, one of the things is with taboo thoughts is that there's so much shame and stigma and embarrassment that comes with them. And so in this series, I think one of at least the goal that I wanted to set for myself, and I want to hear what your goals are too, is to really destigmatize this and really help people understand how normal these are and really hopefully open up an avenue for more conversation about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Same thing. Exactly right. So, October 10th through the 16th is technically OCD Awareness Week, right? But as you know, some folks, of course, we sometimes think about, well, first of all, we don't deal with this for a week, right? This or a month. Like this is a lifelong journey, and I think exactly right. One of the goals is like, if since this is a special time we highlight OCD, I think it's such a great thing to really normalize it, like you said, and to, really recognize how OCD actually shows up and in kind of ways you can maybe think of it a little differently so you can help yourself, get into learning the right tools and strategies to get better, because you can get better.
Right.
And, not be stuck in this forever.
Yeah. And so well said, right? It's like, it's so, it sounds nice to have a week to bring awareness to OCD, but people who struggle with it, it's a day in, day out fight and sometimes a minute by minute fight. And so, so on this series, really, what Christina and I are going to do is we're going to kind of break this down into three parts to help, the structure of this series, but also because each one's going to build on itself. So if you're here with us on part one, make sure to go into part two and part three. And then also, I just want to quickly let you guys know, Christina and I are also going to be doing an in-depth live workshop where we're actually going to be going live on live Q&A and live discussion at the end in October 27th. And so there's going to be a link down below where you guys can check that out and join us, because, it's one thing to learn about them, but it's another to be live and to be able to ask questions and really get real feedback in real time. And we want to try to provide that to you guys because we know how many people struggle with them, and we want to give you the opportunity to get some assistance.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely right. Live is always, I think it's just so beneficial when you can really come on there and go right through that experience together.
Yeah. And I'm so excited to like be doing this with you, Christina, because it's like, well, one, we've known each other for a while, and, it's so cool to talk to someone who really is as competent as you are and really has the experience you have in working with all this stuff. And, I think when we both can take our both perspectives and experiences, like we're able to kind of hit it from two different, from multiple prongs, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So, so with that said, let's go in and talk about taboo thoughts. Right. And, so when you hear taboo thoughts, right, let's just start there. Like, what do you, when someone's coming to you initially and is like, hey, I'm struggling with intrusive or taboo thoughts, what's kind of the first thing that you start with when you're working with that person?
So it's a really good question. And I also kind of want to hear for you too, right? Because I think the biggest thing that I've recognized over time is when you're having thoughts that you deem as like bad or inappropriate, right? Or because society or maybe even your family or your environment, places a lot of weight on them and judges them, or like, oh, you shouldn't have those. So, and then here you are having them, right? People come in and there's just a lot of weight with it in the room.
Yeah.
So usually I'll ask a simple question, kind of, can you give me some examples? And that's the first way I kind of see where the people are at. And usually what happens is they kind of get stuck and they kind of get choked up and freeze. And it's things like, oh, I don't know, and then when I see that in the room, I step in, especially in the very beginning, and start to rattle off a whole slew of different thoughts that, people would be like, whoa. And I'm like, yeah, here we go. There it is,
Right.
And
and exactly the same with me. Right. Because it's like, well, one, in my own journey with OCD definitely fell into that kind of pure O category, if you will. Which really pure O doesn't actually exist in the sense of there's always compulsions, right? As we've kind of, it's been kind of debunked. But I think that first thing that you're saying, that's kind of what I wanted to do today. And the reason I asked you that is because there's so much shame and guilt and embarrassment that gets carried with these thoughts, and they've been suppressed and held secretive so long, just because the fear of even speaking it out, the judgment one's afraid that's going to happen, all of that stuff. So just the very first thing, if someone ever is talking to me and says, hey, Matt, I'm dealing with taboo thoughts, and I do that same thing that you do, right? Where first off, usually it's just giving that person the space to be like, hey, dude, so tell me what it is. And I usually always start with like, literally, there's nothing you could say that I haven't heard, because if you do OCD therapy for any length of time, you get to hear some very unique ideas and thoughts that the mind produces. And the other thing, so yes, that space of just like, hey, let's let that valve that you've been holding on to for a long time open and just lay it all out for me. And what usually happens is when they say all this stuff and they're expecting me to like be repulsed or disgusted by them, and I just sit there calmly and like, oh, okay, yeah, I've heard that a million times. It's just this, it's almost like this weight just kind of falls off their shoulder, because it's like, I'm not the only one, right? Like I'm not a freak or some weird person. It's like, this is actually a normal thing people have.
And I have to say that I want everybody to recognize too, that it's not like it magically happens always out the gate. Sometimes people can still be nervous, but it can take a couple of conversations. And by, I think, being somebody like you said, which is very true. I like to use humor because that's just me. And I always will crack a joke and be like, look, you're gonna have to work really, really hard to try to shock me, okay? But good luck. If you want to take on that challenge, I'm down, right? And people start to laugh, and then like, okay. So it does take a couple rounds to kind of warm up and feel you out, for folks to finally see and recognize, like, yeah, you literally mean like that, you don't care, like you literally don't care, right? And then they start to relax and start to trust, and then like, yeah, like here we go, like whatever it is, just lay it on me, right? Well, but that's the piece of it, I think, of the magic, because let's be real here, the fact is, talking about some really uncomfortable topics is uncomfortable, right? And the reality is, like I tell people, like, I think generally we can all agree, like we kind of generally don't want to like rape each other, like maybe let's not murder each other, I don't know, maybe we can agree on that, right?
Less,
like, hey,
less pedophilia talk is better, right?
Maybe we can not do that, right? But then suddenly, like, if we get that, but then you're having these intrusions, so we have to recognize that the reality is, it is going to feel funky, it's going to feel off, you're going to have an emotional reaction. And that's normal, right? It's normal to have that reaction. It's normal to recognize that something's off and I don't like these. But you gotta also kind of not just get stuck there, like I say, right? Like we gotta normalize it, and then we have to recognize we gotta keep moving to help get to another side of this experience.
Right, because normalizing, right, is really the first step as in the treatment process, right? I mean, when we're talking about overcoming taboo thoughts, normalizing the idea that you are experiencing these random thoughts in your mind and you're not the only person is a very cathartic step in the process. Because like I was saying, like, the average time, I think, between onset and getting help is oftentimes like 7 years, I believe, for someone with OCD. So meaning, sometimes people have been struggling with these thoughts 10, 20 years and never told anybody. And you think about carrying something like that with you for that length of time, and we know how often OCD loves to like jump into different, all the aspects of our life, whether it's our relationships or our, relationships with our kids or all the vacations we go on, it's always kind of there. Right. So that space to just normalize and open up is critical. And I think the next step that I take is really helping people understand. And this is like one of the things that was like a huge thing for me in my own recovery, was that the thoughts in your head aren't you, right? Like you are the observer of the thought, meaning that there's a separation there. And because you have a thought in your head, that's not reflective of who you are, what you want, or anything related to that. Like there's this idea of the thoughts being ego dystonic, meaning like you actually know these thoughts have nothing to do with what you really want, which is why they cause so much distress in the first place, right? And really helping the person separate themselves from their thoughts is really the next major step, I guess, I try to take with a person. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, when you were saying that's really kind of what was going through my mind as well, because, it's really common to, and how could you not, right? How could you not when you're having these thoughts that are so difficult, right? That are heavy or dark or really sexual or really graphic and intense. And you're like, oof, like, stuff you maybe, seen in movies or maybe even read a news article about real life people who, like do that stuff. And suddenly you're getting bombarded with this. It's difficult to not assign meaning to it. And that's why I always tell folks, like, when you're having that experience, not only is it that, but you start to turn against yourself. You start to go into this part of, oh my gosh, maybe I'm a bad person, right? Like maybe like what does this actually mean and say about me? And the reality is, until you learn the stuff, and that's the problem, because when you're sitting with the stuff, it's so distressing. You're not gonna like really tell anybody, because you're gonna think, my God, people are gonna think I'm weird and they're gonna judge me. So like, oh,
or maybe you did tell someone and they did think that, right?
And maybe they did, exactly.
And maybe you had someone that had that bad reaction, that, or maybe like even worst case, you went to an actual therapist who doesn't understand OCD.
Exactly.
And the person hospitalized you.
Exactly right.
Or something like that, where they're like, you must be a real threat to your child. I need to remove them, and so it makes sense of why people hold on to this. And that's why I'm so excited for this series, and in this, the live workshop we're doing later this month, is because it needs to get out there that there are, what people don't realize about the intrusive thoughts, and you said it really well, is that it's not the thought that's the problem, is that you are appraising the thought and you have beliefs about yourself, about what that means that you had the thought. And that's what you're reacting to is not the thought, but your story about the thought. Exactly. Because everyone and their mother has intrusive thoughts from time to time in their life. But because you have a belief structure or a story or an appraisal about that thought and what that means, that's actually what's causing that reaction within you, that then drives compulsions, that then feeds the loop. And we'll talk about all that as we get into this, but realizing that once we can start changing the story you have about the thoughts instead of the thoughts themselves, that is like that's where big shift starts to happen for individuals.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, meaning, right? So as humans, we're meaning making machines. So I mean, and if you're having a lot of intrusive thoughts versus from time to time, right? Time to time, you can forget about them and you're kind of back to your baseline. But what about when you're not at baseline, because you keep having anxiety and panic and all the stuff, because all this internal processes are happening, right? So how could you not assign meaning or think that must mean something significant? Why else would it be happening, right? Because you just don't understand. And we are notorious as human beings with this thing called consciousness to want to have meaning in everything. And one of the most incredible pieces in my own journey with having OCD has been to really recognize and tease out and separate and see, man, some of the stuff actually literally, Christina, has no meaning. Like your brain is producing a lot of garbage and man, it feels really real right now. And I get stuck and I have to use tools just like anybody else. And I use them and then I, kind of get a little space suddenly again and I can see it clearly and I'm like, oh man, geez, Louise. Wow, okay. I have to remind myself, you don't have to believe everything you think. Not everything that pops in is a great idea. Like you can have a bazillion ideas, maybe one of them is amazing, but a whole lot of them are usually garbage.
Usually a bunch of BS. And that's a really good question to start with, right? It's just like, okay, so someone, let's say comes in and they're having some kind of taboo thoughts. I usually ask them like, okay, well, how many times has that happened? Right. So like, let's say they're having harmful thoughts, towards a loved one, right? Like, what if I snap and hurt someone? Right. And we're going to go in today on this, to really all the different types of thoughts. And I wouldn't say all the thoughts, right? Because let's be honest, there's billions of thoughts that people can have. What we're going to talk about is kind of like the main categories that we usually encounter, and just to really help you guys understand what they are. Because maybe this is the first time that you've ever even heard about this. you know, and if that's the case, then, oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're here. Right.
Yes.
But one of the things that I like to ask is, like, people will say, well, I've been worrying about harming, you know, let's say my mother, or, you know, my son, whatever. And I'll ask, like, okay, how many times have you done that? Like, how many people have you killed in the past? And they're always like, well, none. And I'm like, oh, how long have you been worrying about that? Well, you know, like 10 years. Okay. But and that's where it's like, that's where we start to separate the idea of, okay, well, there's a big difference between I'm actually a person who hurts people, or I'm a person that worries about hurting people. Right. Or I'm having this experience about worrying about this. And that separation, sometimes, like, people don't have that, right? They really think that because these thoughts, that means this is who I am. And it's like, no, oh my goodness, it's so separate. It's apples and oranges, you know?
Exactly.
So,
God, as you're talking, there's like so many things that are coming to my mind, but I'm like, you know what, we're gonna have to parking lot some of the stuff for another time. But like,
and we definitely got like a lot to go into throughout this series and the live workshop. So let's go ahead and talk about on this part today. Let's go ahead and go through some categories. And so we'll kind of just trade off, you know. And so you want to start with the first category? It sounds like
sure.
a fun one.
We can get into some of the names, some of the categories for the taboo thoughts.
So let's go ahead and set off a little disclaimer here real quick, because just to make sure, like, we understand, right? When we're talking about OCD, we're talking about obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Which is a mental health condition. And what we're talking about here is having intrusive thoughts about these categories, right? So what we're talking about here, we're going to talk about themes like sexual orientation and bestiality and harming people and, you know, yelling racist words out. What we're not talking about is actually acting on these things. We're talking about, my mind is flooding me with thoughts related to this topic, and I don't want these thoughts in my head. Okay. Exactly. And really making sure that we understand what we're both talking about today. Okay. Exactly. And this is, and it all is really founded in a real simple idea of this idea of the thoughts being what we call ego dystonic versus ego syntonic. And ego is your self-concept. Dystonic means these thoughts are not in alignment with your self-concept, where ego syntonic would be thoughts that are in alignment with your self-concept, right? And so when we talk about the idea of having an intrusive, harmful thought about someone, normally, not 9 times out of 10, it's about someone you love and would never want to hurt. And this is very different than someone fantasizing about hurting someone and taking action on that. That is not what we're talking about today, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. Okay. And I just really want to, like, plant that flag in the sand and really understand that idea of these thoughts are, the person understands them to be ego dystonic and not reflective of things they really want.
Exactly. I think, that's a really good point to always make and clarify, because it's true. People often get confused and think, well, if you're having it, doesn't that mean that, you know, you maybe want to? And it's like, no, there's actually a biological component of OCD that's happening, and you got to kind of really grasp that and then go from there. Yeah. So you kind of already started off and named some of the topics. We'll
go ahead.
Let's go. Let's actually, I'm going to, you know, really list them out. So we have bestiality. So in bestiality, there could be a couple of things, you know, where it's like, you know, fear that you're going to maybe like step on an animal and hurt them, or it can be something like, you know, what if you pet them in a way that maybe was sexual or too close to their genitals or something, and what if you liked it, or what if you're maybe then attracted to your animal? So that would be an example. And I don't know that I'm going to give example on every single one of them. I'm just going to name
like
them.
one or two examples is good. You know what I mean? Just to kind of really like high level it. But another thing I wanted to point out though, with these thoughts, like on bestiality is a really good example, is that a lot of people, what we need to realize is people don't think the same, right? Some people think in words, and like, you know, those ideas of what if thoughts are very the intrusive thought. Other people literally have images, right? Intrusive images. And so realizing that the mind can be both, you know, some people have both, but if you're having words and sentences like, what if I'm attracted to my dog, versus an actual image of an act with your dog that you don't want, those are the same intrusive thoughts we're talking about, right? It's this thing that's kind of happening in your conscious awareness, right?
Yeah, well, intrusion, right? Like you don't want this thing, right? You don't want this thing in your mind, but no matter what you do, it pops in. And I think that's actually, if we can pause for a second on the topics, that's actually what's the most important thing here, right? It's that intrusions are, it's not like it's something happening out here. Like you can't, you're grasping at air, right? You can't grasp it. It's
Mm-hmm.
in your mind, just it just pops right into your, that imagery, like you said, or
Right.
this conscious thought suddenly goes through your mind, and you can't like grasp it, you can't
Right.
control it, and then you get so much doubt. So, something like bestiality is one, of course, that would be distressing. Then we have harm, right? Harm and aggressive content, right? Those kind of themes around, hurting, let's say, somebody else, or or like I've had somebody where they had this fear, like, what if I raped somebody and I'm
Mm-hmm.
not remembering, right?
Mm-hmm.
um we have
And
sexual, yeah,
well,
go
and
ahead.
with harm, I mean, that can go, like you're saying, it can go from the random stranger. It can also be like, I've had plenty of moms who have fears about hurting their infant children,
Yes.
right? And to the point where it's so distressing, they don't even want to pick up the child because they're afraid that could happen, or that what if that happened, right? And you
Yeah,
can see that's what I mean when you see this as OCD, when you understand this as OCD, is like, that mom is probably the last person in the entire world to
that's
ever
right.
do anything harmful to the person.
That's right.
There's probably not a harmful bone in her body, but the thought is so distressing that they literally don't even want to be near the baby, right?
That's right.
You see what I'm saying?
That's
And
right.
so
That's right. That's
so
right.
yeah, and so go ahead with sexual, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything you're saying, it's true for all of these things. Exactly right. Again, that's a dystonic part, right? When you really listen to somebody who has OCD, one of the first things you're going to pick up and see immediately is everything in their body and in their being is like, I don't want this, but they're constantly unsure, but what if, and I just
Mm-hmm.
don't know it yet, right? And that's like
Mm-hmm.
such a key indicator.
Right.
So like with sexual, same thing, right? It could be these sexual intrusive thoughts, it could be images. I mean, I've definitely had plenty of people I've worked with who've had, I had a teenager who suddenly was having intrusive thoughts about um, gangbanging, or having that happen to
Mm-hmm.
her, or maybe being sexually involved with somebody who was like 4 times her elder, that she found, inappropriate and gross, and was like, what the heck? But
Yeah.
her brain was suddenly popping in these images, and she was in tears,
Yeah.
um,
And these can all overlap, right? And so
yeah,
like, this is
yeah,
the thing, to kind of like, it's not just one theme. Usually there's multiple themes kind of happening at
exactly,
the same time. And the
yeah.
thing that I really want to stress here is like, okay, yes, obviously we're talking about, adult concepts here, right? So we just want to make sure we understand that. But like, I remember having someone who was worrying about having or having like sexual imagery in their mind about Jesus and the Virgin Mary, right? And it was so, the person, essentially stopped eating, right? Because they felt so terrible about these thoughts that were totally beyond their control, right?
Exactly.
And that's the thing, is that the thoughts feel like they're so intense sometimes that it's like all the person can even, like, handling day-to-day life becomes very tough for the person when these thoughts are happening, you know what I mean?
Well, exactly. I mean, you get consumed, right?
Right.
Because how can you not? I mean,
Right.
it's popping in left and right. I mean, you get so stressed out that I mean, the level of stress goes to the roof,
Right.
and like, yeah, it's really difficult to do anything. And you're right. The thing is that it's never just a one pure theme. Things can bounce around, and I mean, it's a brain, right? So it's whatever your
Mm-hmm.
brain starts to latch onto, and you can have some repetitive themes, or one or two maybe that are more bigger focal points. But I certainly remember, again, I didn't know it at the time,
Right.
but as I learned this, I was like, oh my god, I remember I was having some intrusive thoughts about a stepdad of mine, and I
Right.
was like,
Right. Right.
what?
Right.
And now looking back, I'm like, oh my god, that's what
Mm-hmm.
that was. And at the time I was like, oh, I guess, do I want to do this? Am I like a
Right.
Lola thing? Like, what's going
Right.
on? Like, it was
Right.
weird,
Right. Well, and there you go. Instead of dismissing the thought, right, we come up with stories, right? And the mind will, there's this interesting book called The Imp of the Mind, right, by Dr. Lee Baer, who's a OCD treatment specialist. And he talks about how that part of your mind will usually always create what you perceive to be the worst thing possible.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, that's why it's so, people are like, why would I be having these thoughts? Well, because you think it's the worst thing you could ever have,
yeah,
right? Like
exactly,
that's in many ways, that is the reason. But
exactly.
and everyone always says, well, I just want a different theme, Matt. Like, can I trade my theme in for this? Because I understand the harm thing, but this whole thing, I heard everyone, I said the same thing, right? I think this theme is the hardest, and everyone says that, and because it is for that person.
Well,
you know?
exactly, right? When people ask, well, what's the most difficult thing you've worked with, or what's the hardest one? And I'm like, whatever one you're dealing with, because
Yeah.
that's the one. That's the
Yeah.
one that for you, that's the one that's most important for you, that you
Right.
value most, and that's where your issue lies. So it's
Right.
that,
Right.
right? You thinking that'll other one will be easier. Guess what? For that person, that one is like this one
Yeah.
for you. It's literally just like
Exactly.
that. So it's
Exactly.
the experience is really the same.
Right, right, exactly. So, so then on top of sex, then, you know, sexual intrusive thoughts, then there's the whole idea of sexual orientation, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, living in the time we live in today, right? Sexual orientation and, you know, gender and all that stuff, there's so much happening in our everyday life with even like laws being passed, right? So there's so much exposure and even confusion out in the world, right? About,
Mhm.
like what is, you know what I mean? And, you know, because just over the past X amount of years, we've, you know, organizations have developed all these different, you know, genders and all these different identities, right? That have kind of just been really a very new concept, right? And regardless of where you stand on that, the thing is OCD is going to have a field day with it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and so when you talk about sexual orientation, I mean, when I was going to school, it was like, you know, like LGBTQ, right? And really that was kind of like where it stopped. But now
Mhm.
there's all these other things that have been kind of integrated in with, you know,
Mhm.
non-binary and all. And so the OCD, right? What it loves to do is, and this is one of the things that we're going to talk about a lot more in the workshop, but OCD loves to present you with a question that has no answer.
Mhm.
Right, because if you try to answer, by you trying to answer the question, that's what gives the OCD fuel. So if it can present a question to you that you can't answer, it has unlimited food for the rest of its life. You know, you almost
Mhm.
have to think of it like that. And so with sexual orientation, like what happens is the OCD tries to, you know, make you figure out
Mhm.
what your orientation is. And the problem is there is no like test you can take. You can't go into someone and be like, hey, so give me a blood test, and is this straight, is this gay, you know, what does this mean? And it's like, because it's such a, it's such an abstract concept in many ways. Like, yes, of course, like we know who we're sexually oriented to, you know, for the most part, but what the OCD does is takes everything it can and confuses it, right? And
Mhm.
so, and one of the things that you need to understand about OCD is that when you're really in that cycle and that stress response is activated, it's like this dark lens comes over your eyes and everything becomes distorted. So while you may used to be able to go into the locker room and change at the gym with no questions, no problem, right? If OCD latches onto that orientation idea, then it's like, well, did I look at that person? I don't know. Did I feel aroused? I'm not sure, you know. And it's like, what does that mean? Should I, you know, I need to figure this out. And you can't, right? And every time you try to solve the problem, it gets more and more confusing. So
Yeah.
so with, and there's, you know, we'll talk obviously in depth on case studies on sexual orientation OCD, because it's obviously a very common form of OCD.
Mhm.
And it's misunderstood, because the more and more you try to, if you went to a sexuality therapist, you know, like, and they're trying to solve it, it's like it just creates layer upon layer and layer of
Oh
confusion.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I've
Especially
seen
yeah,
that
if it's
time and again.
undiagnosed OCD, right? Like
Yeah,
talk therapy is
right.
so like
So someone's like, well, you know, I think when I was 5, I played patty cake and I'm not sure what that means. And it's like, oh my goodness, you know, so really understanding this is an OCD problem, if that's what it is primarily, you got to treat it as such, because the moment you start going into the content and really taking it at face value, you've kind of already misstepped and gone on the wrong path.
yeah, yeah, definitely.
So,
Yeah. What are
um,
some other ones, Matt?
yeah, so suicidal OCD, um, or suicidal taboo thoughts. And this is, you know, really when someone is um worrying, what if one day I commit suicide? You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And like I said, in a very ego dystonic way, right? This is not someone who is contemplating suicide and wanting, you know, I if and like essentially dwelling in the idea of taking their own life. You know what this is a doubt on like, what if I did that one day? What if things got bad enough where I actually did that? I don't want to do that, right? And they're trying to solve, and again, they're always trying to solve and make sure that they would never do that. You know what I
Yeah, and
mean?
sometimes even have you heard or ever had it where somebody, because I've also worked with some folks where they're like, well, maybe it's not one day, but what if it happens today? Or what if I do want to do it and I'm just like
Right.
lying to myself?
Right. Right.
That's a big one, right?
But there, you know, exactly. And this is why we could never cover every OCD thought, because as you just saw, right, the OCD is so good at anytime you hear a what if, that is the key indicator that is OCD, right? Because you're trying to solve it, right? Someone who's truly in a suicidal state, right? You know, because I don't even like calling someone suicidal in the sense of it's not who they are in identity. They're just in a state of mind where they're so distressed and feel so hopeless they don't see any other alternative. And it's an escape, right? It's the thing about suicide, and I always say this, is it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. That's right. And there's always hope, and there's always a solution out there. There really is. And once you really anchor into that hope, you just need to work to find it. But it is so interesting that, like, yeah, what if I'm just lying to myself? What if I really want to do that? You know what I mean? Like, it just, oh gosh, it's so sneaky on how it throws in all the doubt and uncertainty into each topic, you know?
Yeah. And one thing, I mean, I don't know if a lot of people do know this piece about me, but I do want to kind of throw it in here for a second, because like, so I used to work for San Francisco Suicide Prevention, and I used to do workshops in the Unified School District. And when I did that, part of that for me, some people who know my history, is I was also suicidal for a period of time, and got pretty darn close. And so, like, you know, like exactly what you said, there is a difference when you know, like I tell people too, like when you're actually really in something and you're actively doing something, versus OCD brain, where you're just constantly like in a hamster wheel, like, but what if, 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 and so you're in this constant perpetual, you know, back and forth. Or, you know, you can start doing, of course, some compulsions, which we'll talk about later, but like, you know, there's a really clear difference between like actual clear intent and desire, right? And versus when I'm in my head and I'm just doubting incessantly, and I'm getting lost in this process, and I'm getting more confused, and I'm getting anxious, and I'm getting scared.
Right. Sure. And no, I appreciate you, the transparency and honesty. And I think, you know, I mean, if you've ever really struggled with, you know, mental health, when you've really been into the depths, like you and obviously I have, you know, those kind of ideations are actually very normal as well. Like when you're really down in the pits, and even normalizing that to a certain degree, not that it's okay, but I mean, like, yeah, like sometimes if things feel hopeless, like, but that's why, going back to the idea that, like, there is always hope. And if you're wrestling with taboo thoughts, especially if you're here today, you can get better, right? And it's not like it's a crapshoot either. Like, this only works for some people. It's like, this process works. Exactly. You know, and so, in really trusting it. So
exactly.
Well, I mean, I know we have a few more to cover today, and then we'll tie it up and then move into part 2 in the next episode. But so we talked a little bit about incest already, but that kind of goes into the idea of sexual intrusive, right? But this is really more the thoughts directly towards family members, right? Yeah. And we separate it as its own category because it's common, right? And a lot of times people just struggle with those thoughts. How about the racist taboo thoughts? Like, tell us about those a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually recently had a client who was having more imagery, like was at a store basically, right? And kind of, there was an African-American guy, and he happens to be a Caucasian guy, and he drove away. And then suddenly afterwards was getting all these thoughts about, oh my gosh, what if I go back and I have to go to a store, and then I see him, and what if I, you know, blurt out some racist comments, right? Or what if then, and then it was paired with racist comments and an act of aggression. And so getting bombarded with this kind of both of those things at once, right? And then getting really scared, really anxious. And of course, obviously, like not wanting to go, you know, to that parking lot or near that store, right? Or other folks where they get really freaked out about what if I end up, you know, like, what if I'm, you know, having dinner, or what if I'm walking down the street, and then, you know, what if, you know, I won't even catch myself, and then, you know, boom, I'll say something. Or what if I did say something in the past, or what if I wrote something in a text and I'm not remembering, and oh my gosh, and now, you know, I'm getting stuck in that way.
Well, and so much, you know, and because again, the real fear there, right? And because if you try to do regular talk therapy, it's like, well, let's see if you're subconsciously racist, you know, and all that nonsense that you know, a lot of talk therapists will try to do, and it doesn't get anywhere. It does nothing for the person. And really, you know, and we'll talk about it more on the workshop, I guess, but really when we're talking about the underlying fear there's, right, you know, the underlying fear, this is like just a kind of a weed of a rooted fear of that social rejection and doing behaviors that you totally would be repulsed if you actually engaged in, you know?
Exactly.
And so it's like, and so reminding yourself that the content of your thoughts is not a reflection of who you are, right? That's like right. That is such an important aspect right there to understand. But so when it comes to scrupulosity, right, and we threw this into the taboo thoughts because you can have taboo thoughts related to scrupulosity. Now, scrupulosity is a subform of OCD where people can essentially question and doubt anything related to their faith and existential ideas, right? So this is a broad topic, yes. Scrupulosity, right? Yes. I mean, so what we're talking about here is really more the taboo thoughts related to the scrupulous, you know, ideas, right? So it could be bad thoughts towards God, right? So people might have curse words in their mind towards God, right? They might have sexual imagery about God, or, you know, they're a religious figure, right?
That's
and
right.
And there's you know, I mean, and there's no real, and this is why I don't like, anytime I'm working with someone with OCD, and I know you do this too, we really do the full scope inventory. It's not ever just like, okay, we're just going to work on taboo thoughts. It's like any aspect of OCD that's manifesting, right? So with scrupulosity, it's common to have taboo thoughts and other things like doubts of whether I committed the unforgivable sin, or am I going to go to hell? And then I have these thoughts, and then the OCD is like, well, what if, because I had that thought, now I'm going to go to hell, right? You know what I mean? It just attacks every angle
right
possible.
Back on that hamster wheel.
Right. So it loves to throw that and then attack you right after. You know, like it loves to, like, you know, throw that thought in your mind and then accuse you of being a bad person for having that thought. So,
exactly.
And then let's tie up with the last two here.
I mean, well, we kind of touched on pedophilia a little bit, you know, when we talked about, you know, mom who, you know, maybe would touch her infant inappropriately, right? But we also have like where, you know, somebody walks past, like, you know, a playground and then starts to get these intrusive thoughts, like, well, you know, what if I want to go, you know, grab a kid and do something, or what if I like it, or now, like, if there's anything around like child content, right, they start to get these intrusive images and thoughts. I mean, I had a client I worked with who, like, even just looking at a Jenga box, right, like, was a massive trigger, because you know, there's images of family and kids, and oh my gosh, what if, you know, what does this mean? You know, right. And the same thing with kind of the last point, we have a, you know, psychotic. I often see people, I mean, this is so common, right? And all of these are super common, right? But, you know, thoughts like, what if what if today's the day I go crazy and I end up in the mental ward, like, that's a really big one that comes up for, like, pretty much for everybody that I've ever interacted with OCD.
Well, because if you've ever been in the loop of OCD, you know how chaotic it really feels, right? And you know, so like the idea of what if I crack and become a schizophrenic, you know, what if I get hospitalized, you know, and the thing is right, it's like, it can feel so intense that it's like you actually feel like you're kind of like a hairline away from that actually happening sometimes. But really, you know, separating the two is so important. Like, hey, this is OCD. Sometimes there's these intense moments, and having the tool set to ride through these and to really go through these is really the difference, right? And so so that will tie up today's session, right? We wanted to talk about what this is, and really let's just get it all on the table today. That was the goal, right? And yes, sure, if you're OCD out there and you're it's saying, well, they didn't cover my exact thoughts, so how do I really know that this isn't, you know, if this is for me? Trust me when I say, like, it's anything and everything in related to these categories at all, right? There's no way we're going to be able to say every thought. So what we tried to do is cover a very broad concept. But if you're hearing a what if there, it's OCD, right? And now that we know that, and so here's the thing though, every topic we just covered, that isn't the problem that you have, right? What we want to move into now is really understanding that you actually have an OCD problem, and shifting that right there is critical to your success. So what we're going to talk about in the next episode, or the next part of this series, is what it means to actually be an OCD problem and the things you're doing that are actually keeping you stuck.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So, so I'm really excited to continue this series, and yeah,
Yes.
thank you guys so much for being with us, and thank you, Christina,
Absolutely.
obviously.
Thank you, Matt.
And so we'll see you guys on part 2 next week. So see you
Awesome.
then. All right.
Bye.
Bye.